Susan was 58 years old. She and her husband had been married for 33 years, and their 2 children had long since grown up, married, and started their own lives. Now it was just the 2 of them in a quiet suburban home. From the outside, their life looked like the typical, peaceful routine of a retired couple. But lately, something unspoken had been stirring inside Susan. She felt irritable for no reason. Waves of sadness would hit her out of nowhere, and when she tried to talk about it, the words just wouldn't come. If anyone asked, she'd brush it off with a vague, "I'm fine." But the more time she spent alone, the more her emotions seemed to churn like a stormy sea. One afternoon, Susan stood in the kitchen, holding a glass of water, staring into space. Nothing particularly upsetting had happened, and no one had hurt her, but her chest felt tight, like it was being squeezed. Her shoulders were heavy, her heart felt cold, and she couldn't stop sighing. The daily tasks she used to breeze through now felt overwhelming, and even her husband's light-hearted teasing, which she once laughed off, grated on her nerves. She didn't know why she felt this way or what had gone wrong, but one thing was clear. She wasn't the same Susan she used to be. She wasn't sleeping well. Mornings felt heavy, and evenings stretched on with her sitting in silence. Her emotions were all over the place, and the days when she felt hurt or upset outnumbered the calm ones. Still, she kept it all inside. She pushed through, brushed it off, and scolded herself for feeling this way. That night, when her husband reached out to her in bed, Susan quietly turned away. She pretended to be asleep, saying nothing. For the first time, she avoided his touch. In that moment, it felt like something inside her heart flickered out, like a candle snuffed by the wind. Her husband had noticed the change in Susan, but the words he chose were the last thing she wanted to hear. "You've been off lately. Is it menopause?" The question, tossed out so casually, sank her heart like a stone. He wasn't wrong. Her body didn't feel like it used to, and her emotions were harder to control. But those words stung. His tone was dismissive. His face looked tired, and the timing of it all made her feel so alone. Susan stayed silent. She didn't know what to say. Truthfully, she didn't even want to explain. She wasn't looking for his understanding or his comfort. She just wanted him to acknowledge that her feelings were heavy. But instead, he'd reduced it all to one word: menopause. Her complex emotions were boxed up like a medical diagnosis, and in that moment, Susan felt like she had to justify herself. Maybe it is menopause, she thought, but these feelings, they're more than just a phase. She didn't say it out loud. She just turned her head slightly, her face expressionless. After that night, Susan grew even quieter. She was afraid that if she spoke, she'd hear the same dismissive response, or worse, have to explain herself all over again. So she chose silence. That night, Susan lay awake, turned away from her husband. The room was still, except for the steady tick of the clock. Her husband came to bed late, changed quietly, and slipped under the covers with familiar movements. There was no conversation, no glance between them. It wasn't the first time, but that night, the air felt heavier than usual. After a while, her husband reached out cautiously. Before his hand could touch her, Susan slowly curled deeper into herself. She pretended to sleep, steadying her breath. His hand hesitated, then withdrew. He pulled back quietly, and they spent the night side by side as if nothing had happened. But for Susan, it was the first time she'd turned away from his touch, and in her heart, she felt something quietly go out. It wasn't the lack of physical closeness that hurt most. It was the realization that their hearts weren't connecting. She wasn't angry at him, and it wasn't that she didn't want intimacy. It was just that, after a day of feeling so disconnected, no touch could feel like comfort. Feelings don't just fade with time, she realized. That night, Susan learned that distance in a marriage doesn't come from a lack of words. It comes from the inability to speak. After that night, Susan grew even more reserved. She greeted her husband briefly in the mornings, ate meals in silence, avoided eye contact, and answered questions with as few words as possible. It felt easier that way. Without conversation, there were no conflicts, and in silence, no one got hurt. The quiet moments began to pile up. At first, her husband didn't seem to mind. He probably thought it would pass in a few days. But as time went on, and Susan's demeanor didn't change, he started to hold back too. Words became scarce, smiles faded, and expressions dulled. They could spend an entire day in the same house, staring at their phones, without exchanging a single word. Susan didn't mind the silence. In fact, it felt like a relief. She hadn't realized how hard it had become to speak. There was a time when she and her husband would sit together, chatting about their day or laughing over a TV show. But now, even thinking of something to say felt exhausting. So she chose to stay quiet. "I'm not talking less because I want to push him away," she told herself. "Our marriage isn't falling apart just because I'm quiet," but deep down, a growing sense of isolation was creeping in. Her emotions felt thinner. Fatigue settled in easily, and getting through the day started to feel like a small battle. Even without anyone saying or doing anything, Susan was growing weary. It was a particularly windy afternoon. The trees outside were swaying wildly, and Susan was closing the living room window when she overheard her husband's voice. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and he was on the phone. His voice was low, but his words were clear. Susan's been acting so strange lately. Ever since menopause hit, she barely talks, and she's always giving me the cold shoulder. The words pierced her like a dagger. She wasn't shocked. She just stood quietly by the door, listening. Her husband chuckled lightly as he continued. "It's like living with a stranger. The house feels suffocating. I don't even know what I did wrong. It's just exhausting." Susan stepped back to the living room without a sound. She sat at the dining table, turned on the TV, but the noise didn't register. Her heart felt like it had caved in. Those words weren't just a complaint. They confirmed that she was completely misunderstood. "He doesn't even see how much I'm struggling," she thought. Or maybe he never even cared to notice. Her husband's voice no longer felt warm, and the decades they'd spent together suddenly seemed hollow. That day, Susan admitted to herself, for the first time, that she'd been emotionally alone all along. The years of silence had built up, and now they were so far apart that she didn't even know where to begin. That night, she couldn't sleep. She tossed and turned, staring at the ceiling for hours. It felt like a quiet thread in her heart had snapped. Later that night, Susan sat at the dining table and pulled out a small piece of paper. She held the pen for a long time before writing a single sentence. "This weekend, I'm going away by myself. I need a break from talking." She left the note in the center of the table and went to bed. It was a message to her husband, but also a declaration to herself. For the first time, she made a decision without anyone's permission. It wasn't just a trip. It was a step toward protecting herself. The next morning, her husband saw the note and looked surprised. "A trip? Out of nowhere? Is this because of menopause? Are you okay?" Susan looked at him for a moment, then gave a quiet smile. "Menopause isn't an illness. It's a change." He didn't know what to say, and Susan didn't offer more explanation. She packed a bag, chose an outfit for herself for the first time in ages, and left without a plan. She didn't book a hotel or research destinations. This time, she needed space, not structure. She decided to spend time apart from her husband, without contact. Strangely, it didn't feel scary. Susan took a bus to a quiet coastal town. At a rest stop, she bought a coffee and felt her heart lighten for the first time in a while. A day where she didn't have to answer to anyone or worry about anyone's expectations. It felt like a gift. Deep inside, she could feel a sense of rest rising. Why did it take me so long to take care of myself? She wondered, but then she smiled. At least I'm doing it now. When she stepped off the bus, Susan walked slowly to her lodging. The sea breeze was strong and the air was cool against her face, but she didn't mind. The unfamiliar scenery calmed her mind. She checked into a small bed and breakfast near the shore. The room was simple, and the sound of waves crashing came through the window. Susan sat on the bed, still unpacked, and stared out at the ocean. It was quiet. For the first time in ages, no one was asking her anything, and no one was waiting for her. In that stillness, she could finally hear her own voice. Who have I been living for all this time? For her husband, her kids, her family. She couldn't even remember how many choices she'd made because she truly wanted to. Those were my choices, she used to think. But now she realized they were more about duty than desire. Susan poured herself a cup of hot tea, held it with both hands, and closed her eyes. Her heart began to soften. She felt like she could spend the whole day in silence, and it would be okay. A day without expectations, without having to respond to anyone. It was a way of living she'd never allowed herself before. That day, she did nothing. She sat with an open book, stared out the window, listened to the waves, and closed her eyes. Nothing remarkable happened, but her heart felt strangely at peace. And then it hit her. I've been neglecting myself for far too long. It's time to come back to me. 3 days later, Susan returned home. When she opened the door, the house was silent. Nothing had changed, but something in her heart had shifted. As she took off her shoes and stepped into the living room, she noticed a small note on the dining table. It was her husband's handwriting. "I'm sorry, I've been seeing you only as part of the family for too long. Want to start over and listen to the person you are, to the feelings you're carrying." Susan read the note slowly, then read it again. Tears welled up unexpectedly. It was just a small piece of paper, but it held a sincerity she hadn't seen from him before. In all their years together, he'd never been one for words or grand gestures, but this quiet, simple note stayed with her. She sat at the table holding the note. The empty chair across from her seemed larger than usual. She bowed her head, and the tears she'd held back began to fall. They weren't tears of anger or sadness. They were tears of relief. Someone was finally trying to see her. Her husband came home late that evening. When he walked in, Susan nodded silently. For the first time, they looked into each other's eyes. After a brief pause, she spoke quietly. "Thank you. That note, it made my time away feel worthwhile," and sat down without a word. That night, they shared a late dinner together for the first time in a long while. They didn't talk much, but a warmth lingered at the table. After dinner, Susan sat quietly, looking at her husband. Their eyes met briefly, and he scratched his head, a little awkward, but this time she spoke first. "I used to be okay. I could laugh off whatever you said, and handling my feelings alone wasn't hard, but at some point, it stopped being easy." Her husband nodded silently. Susan continued, "I'd cry for no reason, get hurt by the smallest things, and I didn't even recognize myself anymore. You called it menopause. And you're right. It is menopause. But you never asked how I was feeling, not once." She paused, took a sip of cooled tea, and steadied herself. Her voice was calm but firm, her emotions settled but deep. "I realized I wanted someone to lean on, someone who'd notice my heart was heavy, even if I didn't say a word. Just one person like that would have made it bearable." Her husband didn't speak. He lowered his head slightly and listened until she finished. Susan went on. "I went away alone this time, but I didn't really want to be alone. I just didn't want to keep explaining myself." Her husband let out a slow breath. Then, quietly, he said, "Let's talk from now on. I didn't realize how much I was missing. I'm sorry." That night, they grew a little closer. They didn't suddenly become talkative, but the small note on the table and her voice brought out feelings that had been buried for years. Menopause wasn't just a phase of emotional ups and downs. Susan began to understand this as she moved through it. It wasn't just physical changes or mood swings. Menopause was a time when the weight of her past life settled heavily on her heart. All the words she'd held back for her family, the hurts she'd brushed off, the feelings she'd postponed because now wasn't the time, they all came rushing back. One day, Susan sat quietly in front of a mirror. The face looking back was familiar, yet unfamiliar. There were more wrinkles now, and her eyes seemed a little dimmer. But she gazed at herself for a long time, and in her heart she whispered, "Susan, you've worked so hard. You've held so much in. It's okay to let your feelings out now." A single tear rolled down her cheek. It wasn't sadness or resentment. It was the moment she finally acknowledged her own heart. Menopause wasn't a crisis. It was a time to look back at her heart. She used to think holding in her emotions was kindness, that staying stoic was mature. But now she knew better. Speaking her feelings kept relationships alive, and showing her heart brought closeness. She stopped asking, "Why am I like this?" Instead, she told herself, "I'm still a good person. I'm just getting to know myself again." That realization alone lightened her heart. She didn't need her husband to fully understand her anymore, and it didn't sting as much when her kids called less often, because now she was the one listening to herself. Susan learned that menopause wasn't about enduring. It was about finding the courage to speak. The silence she'd kept wasn't weakness. It was a shield born from fear of being misunderstood. Now, she decided to step out from behind it. One day, her husband asked, "Are you doing better now?" Susan smiled quietly. "A little. I'm not completely okay yet, but being able to talk about it, that's made me so much better." She didn't explain further. Instead, she started practicing speaking. When she was tired, she said so. When she felt hurt, she quietly shared it. It felt awkward at first, but with each try, her heart grew lighter. The moment she allowed herself to not be okay, Susan became stronger, and she realized that what she'd been waiting for wasn't perfect understanding. It was just one person saying, "I hear you." Now, Susan is someone who can speak. She's learned to express her feelings without holding back, to protect herself by speaking up. That alone means she's navigating this season well. One day, she murmured to herself, "I'm okay now. I've decided to hold my own heart first." Those words carried an understanding of the years she'd suppressed and a firm resolve to protect herself moving forward. If this story has touched your heart, it might mean you're walking through a similar season. The feelings you've spoken in silence, the emotions you've held on to without sharing, it's okay to let them out now. Menopause isn't about enduring, it's about rediscovering yourself. You're not someone who can't speak. You're someone who's been waiting for the chance to be heard. It's okay to start now. You're someone who can speak. Your feelings are precious truths that don't need explanation. And those truths have the power to bring you back to life. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to join us as we walk through more of your stories. Let's all become people who can speak